In terms of the slave trade, the Asiento, remember that the Asiento was established by the Portuguese. Let's look at causes for this. Why would the Portuguese buy people from the western coast of Africa and move them all the way across an ocean into the Caribbean and into Brazil? Well, the Spanish had conquered the Native Americans and established the encomienda. So why wouldn't they just use the native labor force that they had conquered? Why was the encomienda replaced? Now you got to be specific, Elizabeth. Got to give SFI. What was it about the Native Americans that made, yes, exactly, okay, so the encomienda was replaced by Asiento because the native population was being wiped out by smallpox, and also they were more successful at escaping the encomienda because they knew the area, they knew the language, they had a social support network. And so the Portuguese, in their route around Africa to get to India, are going to start getting involved in the slave trade. Now remember, Old World slavery is different from New World slavery. Slavery had existed prior to 1492, but it was different. Remember, the original major source of slave labor had come from the Kievan Rus up in Europe. That's where we get the name slave, from the Slavic peoples in Europe. So Old World slavery was not based on race. It was based on your position in society, typically peasants or people from lower classes, prisoners of war, criminals, debtors. And it wasn't as deadly, it wasn't hereditary, and it wasn't permanent. That all changes with the Portuguese. They create a new strand of slavery that is even more inhumane and barbaric than just Old World slavery. But it's important to note, while you can compare and contrast the types of slavery, you can't argue like, oh, one is better or worse than the other. It's still bad, right? It's slavery. So with the Asiento, the Portuguese go in and they purchase people who have been captured and kidnapped by slave raiders. Eventually, the slave raiders are going to run out of people at the bottom of society, the people who are traditionally a part of that class, and they're going to start snatching up anybody they can, including elite. So this is going to be hugely disruptive to the governments and the society of the mighty African empires that exist, especially in the western coast, like in Mali. Now, in this Asiento, this was an incredibly brutal passage from Africa to the Caribbean and to Brazil, the Middle Passage, which would take 6 weeks or longer, and the mortality rate was extremely high. About approximately 50% of the kidnapped peoples from the African continent would die en route to the New World. Okay, but they were brought in such huge numbers that they actually start making up the majority of the population in the New World. In Brazil, they made up almost 2/3 of the population, over half. In the modern United States, they made up 1/5 of the population. But this is a form of genocide because in this African diaspora, millions of African peoples died, mostly those of the male gender, because remember, 2/3 of the population that was kidnapped were men. So I go into a little bit more detail on this with the chapter on Africa and the Atlantic world. This map just shows where the majority of the kidnapped peoples came from, is along the western coast of Africa, because remember, again, Portugal was involved along the western coast on their way to the spice trade. A majority of the captured peoples go to the Caribbean, where they're forced to work on plantations. The life expectancy of an enslaved person on those plantations was less than 2 years, so extremely brutal and hard work. Then the Portuguese, obviously, with their colony in Brazil, are going to be importing a large population there as well. And so they have a high demand for this slave labor. And as a result of that, they're going to try to pack as many people as possible into those slave ships that pass along this 6-week journey from the western coast of Africa to the New World. And so the population, the mortality rate is going to be extremely high because of the conditions in those slave ships. They were brutal. People packed together and chained together, unable to move, unable to go to the bathroom. They had to stay where they were. Very little access to food and water, let alone clean food and water. I have some additional articles and resources on that in the Schoology page as well. For instance, here in the coffin position below deck at the bottom of those ships, they would forcibly pack as many people, the Europeans would, as they could below deck in order to maximize the number of people that they could import into the New World. So for weeks being in a position like that, chained by hands and legs and even by necks, very little exercise or movement whatsoever. If you haven't visited the Equal Justice Initiative Museum in Montgomery, I would highly recommend doing that if you ever get a chance. If you're looking at getting more information into this aspect of history, then that would be an excellent resource. Also, you do have captive peoples revolting against the Europeans and against the slave raiders, but very few of these revolts are successful for a number of reasons. Number one, Africa is not a country. It is an entire continent. You can't treat it like a monolith. You have different geographic areas, you have different languages, you have different aspects in culture. Even though they do have some foundations in like the Bantu religion and the Bantu language, these different peoples from the coast of Africa spoke different languages. It's immensely difficult to plan even just a regular group project. Like if you're all speaking the same language, it's very hard to do that. Imagine trying to start an insurrection, to start a revolt with people that can't understand you. Okay, so that was one of the factors that led to why very few revolts on slave ships were successful. So some economic effects of the exploration. If you talk about economic effects, you're primarily going to see positive effects for Europe, negative effects for the Americans. The age of exploration jumpstarts the golden age of Spain. Okay, the golden century of the 16th century, meaning the 1500s. Their Spanish army is able to increase as a result of the profit that's coming from the New World. They're going to build the Spanish Armada, which is the Spanish Navy, the most powerful navy in the world until this time. So they're going to dominate the sea with their military forces that are paid for by the exploitation of the New World. They're going to make it their mission to proselytize, to spread Catholicism, not only in the New World, but also in the fight against the Protestants, due to that wealth being able to build up their economy. And that wealth is going to primarily comprise of precious metals from the New World. When we say precious metals, we're not talking copper or iron, we're talking bullion, gold and silver. Now, 20% of that gold and silver goes directly to the king and the queen. That's called the Quinto del Rey. That's Spanish for a fifth for the king. Okay, so 1/5 or 20% of all of the gold and silver that is collected is supposed to go directly to the king and queen. Okay, this makes up about 25% of their total income. The remaining 80% goes to the government. It goes into the treasury. The people in the Americas don't get that money. They don't profit off of it. The purpose of the colonies under mercantilism is to enrich the mother countries, not the colonies. In addition to money that is flowing into the Spanish coffers at this time, through the Columbian exchange, you also have the exchange of crops. And these crops, most notably the potato, are going to have a huge demographic impact on the old world. The potato is dense in calories. It has a very high caloric value, and it's also very easily grown. How many of you have ever accidentally forgotten some potatoes in your cabinets in your kitchen, and you go back months later and you're like, oh dang, they're growing arms and legs down there. They're growing all these roots. Potatoes are tubers that can grow underground. They don't need the sun when they're first growing underground and can survive harsh weather, especially cold weather. So the Irish and the Russians are going to latch on to the potato, and it's going to lead to a huge population boom because they're able to grow it in the frozen Russian tundra. So because of the arrival of the potato from the New World to the Old World, like what we see with the banana culturally diffusing from Madagascar to Africa, we're going to see a population boom. More people means you need more stuff for the people, more food, but also more manufactured goods like clothing. Spain is not going to be able to produce as much clothing to support their population. And so if they can't make it themselves, they have to buy it from someone else. They have to import it. But no worries, because they got a ton of gold and silver coming from the New World. So whatever they can't make, they're going to buy, like from markets in India or markets in China. But here's the issue with that. It is bad economic policy to import more than you export, to buy more than you sell. Eventually, that gold and silver isn't going to be worth as much because of inflation. Since we have so much gold and silver coming in, that leads to a price revolution. The gold and silver undergoes inflation, which means it's going to be worth less than it was before. Okay, and inflation is something that occurs naturally. Like, let's say 100 years ago, I had $100. Okay, I'd be doing pretty okay, especially as a woman back then. Right, in the 1900s, I'd be like, yeah, $100, that's good money. But today, does $100 get you very far? No, not nearly as far. So the value of that currency decreases. So they have to spend more silver to get less stuff. So this hurts their economy. Prices and the cost of goods increases because they can't compete against the cheaper goods that are being produced elsewhere. Now, in terms of the effect this has on society, the rich people, the nobles, are actually going to be hurt because they are given money by their vassal lords, by the king and the queen, and they're given a fixed amount every year. So let's say they make $600 a year. They don't have to work for it, they just get it. Well, that $600 a year was probably great in the 1300s, but now in the 1500s, it's worth a lot less. So they become poorer. Even though they're getting the same amount of money, technically, they can't spend it on as much stuff. In contrast, the middle class increases in status because their debts have less value. Let's say I owe somebody $100 in the 1800s. If I owe someone $100 in the 1800s, I owe a lot of money. I'm never going to be able to pay that back. But let's say I owe somebody $100 today. All right, well, that's about as much as I make in a year as a teacher, but still, it's not an impossible amount to pay back. Okay, I'm not going to go bankrupt if I owe someone $100. So the middle class finds that their debts that are owned by the nobles decrease in value. So the nobles aren't getting as much money from the middle class paying off those debts. So the middle class is going to rise in power. When we talk about the Columbian exchange, we're talking about a two-way system. Stuff going from the New World to the Old World, and stuff going from the Old World to the New World. But within the Columbian exchange, from old to new and new to old, there's also a triangular trade. Triangular because it has three legs. The first leg goes from Europe to Africa, and the Europeans bring manufactured goods into Africa to trade. Remember that Africa's main exports during period 2 are gold, salt, ivory, and slaves. But old world slavery is different than what we're going to see in new world slavery started by the Portuguese. Okay, and we're going to talk about those differences. So they come to Africa. They cannot invade Africa because Africa is too strong. Plus, the Europeans are not immune to malaria. And so the Portuguese, right here, has to establish trading ports along the coast of Africa in order to get to Asia. So they only have this coastal line under their control. And so in these trading ports, they show up and they bring manufactured goods like guns and alcohol. Now, the influx of guns, the influx of this weaponry into Africa is going to be hugely disruptive to the African continent. It's going to lead to bloody regional conflict, okay? Especially as the classes in society that are typically captured for the slave trade, like prisoners of war and criminals and debtors, as the Portuguese demand for slaves increases and the number of people at the bottom of society decreases, that means more kingdoms and more tribes are going to go to war with each other so they can capture more prisoners of war to sell to the Portuguese. And also they start grabbing people from the elite classes as they run out of people from the lower classes. And so this is going to be hugely disruptive to the African empires. But remember, the African empires were far too strong for the Europeans to take them on. So the Europeans could not colonize the interior of Africa. Then in the second leg, the Europeans go from Africa to the New World. Okay, remember, they had gone to Africa for slave labor because the encomienda system, where they had forced natives into slave labor, was not as profitable due to the natives dying off from diseases, as well as being able to more successfully escape from that coerced labor. So speaking of diseases, the big ones you need to know. And y'all, you do need to know these items on this map. And I know it looks like a lot, but it's not as bad as it looks. Okay, you can very easily start learning these different topics, but mostly the ones in red are the most important items that you need to know: where they originated, where they went to, and what were the effects of that cultural diffusion. Were they positive effects, negative effects? Were they demographic effects? Were they social effects? Were they economic effects? Things like that. So demographic effects, mostly going to be catastrophic for the Native Americans. It's going to be bad, right? You get the spread of influenza, diphtheria, typhus, whooping cough, measles, the bubonic plague, tuberculosis, malaria, but most importantly, smallpox. The biggest factor in the decline of the indigenous population is going to be the spread of disease, notably smallpox. That's SFI, y'all. All of these terms are SFI. If I ask you, like on an SIQ, give one example of a negative effect on the New World from the Columbian Exchange. You can say one negative demographic effect was the decline of the indigenous peoples because of diseases. Well, what's your SFI? You got to tell me what disease. You can't just be like, oh, COVID. Like, no, that's not the disease. It's smallpox or measles or whooping cough. Okay, those are diseases that would be SFI for the negative demographic effect that you were asked about in the SAQ. So this is going to wipe out about 90% of the population in some areas in the New World. Okay, so huge change over time as well. Used to have millions of Native Americans, and then that population decreases drastically over a century because of not only conquest by the Europeans, but also cultural diffusion and enslavement by the Europeans. In terms of crops from the Old World to the New World, okay, you're going to have a lot of cash crops like sugar and coffee that originated in Mesopotamia, in the Middle East, and Persia, and they're going to be grown in the temperate climates of the Caribbean and Brazil. Okay, so the establishment of sugar plantations, cash crop plantations. And remember, a cash crop is not something you grow for consumption to survive. A cash crop is grown for cash. It's grown for money. It is profitable. Coffee, very expensive. Also, sugar is a cash crop. You don't need it to live, although I might make an argument otherwise, but it is very, very valuable. So those come from the Old World, but they're going to be grown where? In the New World. For the benefit of who? Europe, the mother countries. Remember, under mercantilism, the Native Americans and the Africans who are doing the work, they're not benefiting from it. They're not getting any of that profit. The colonies exist to make the mother country rich under mercantilism, government control of the economy. No supply and demand, no invisible hand of the market, no capitalism, just mercantilism, government control. Some benefits from the Old World transferring things to the New World would also include the diversification of food, particularly meat sources for the New World. Remember that the New World didn't have a lot of beasts of burden. They didn't have cows or cattle or sheep or pigs or horses. They had llamas and alpaca, and that was it. So that was bad for their agriculture. Their agriculture was very inefficient because humans had to do the labor. Their trade was very inefficient because they didn't have beasts of burden to help them with that. But now they have the arrival of a new food source, a new protein source with cattle, sheep, and pigs. Now the horse is going to be very helpful in preserving Native American culture because the arrival of the horse in the New World is going to allow for the Native Americans to more successfully escape, not just as individuals, but as a culture, to North America, to the Western plains of the United States. So y'all may have an idea of Native Americans as, oh, they're on a horse and they're in the plains and there's a bunch of buffalo. That's where we get that idea because the Native Americans from the once mighty empires of the Aztec and the Inca had to flee the conquest of the Europeans, and so they moved into the middle of North America, where they were left alone for a little bit. So they converted to a new lifestyle, a nomadic lifestyle on the pasture lands, hunting buffalo on horses, and thus are able to survive until the United States with Manifest Destiny starts moving into the Western coast. But we'll get to that. So then moving on to the stuff from the New World that went to the Old World. You're going to have some benefits and you're going to have some detriments for this. Obviously, the Old World's going to get a lot of money, gold, silver, cash crops. Under mercantilism, it benefits the Europeans because the Europeans are the mother country of these colonies. But even China benefits from the Columbian Exchange, not because they're colonizing in the New World, okay, but because they're selling stuff to the Europeans. And how are the Europeans buying Chinese goods? By all the silver and gold that they made in the New World. So China gets a lot of that silver from the Columbian Exchange, not directly, but indirectly through trade. New discoveries in the New World in terms of cash crops include cocoa and tobacco. That had not been in the Old World. They discovered it in the New World, and it's going to be very, very popular. So we get chocolate from cocoa, pipes and cigarettes. That's going to be a very popular cash crop that's grown in the New World for consumption in the Old World. So it's yet another cash crop. Again, not grown for consumption. In terms of food crops that are grown for consumption, the most important one is potato. Y'all, the potato is hugely influential in world history. I think it's even one of your ID terms for this unit, right? So I'm sure y'all looked at the terms, you're like, did she seriously put potato? Yes, it is. And you're like, yeah, I know what that is. It's delicious. Okay, well, yeah, you have to talk about the context, though, of why are we learning about it in world history? Population boom. Just like the banana in Africa, as it was diffused out of Madagascar by Indonesian seafarers in the year 500 or so, the potato is going to be a hit in Europe, particularly in Russia and in Ireland, okay? Because the potato can grow anywhere, and they're also full of calories. So they can grow underground, which means they can grow in frozen temperatures like the tundras of Russia. So that's going to allow for a population boom that picks up in Europe. And also cassava, which is another crop from the New World, is going to lead to a population boom in Africa. And that's going to help to defray the severe depopulation that they face as a result of the asiento. Pineapples, y'all, pineapples are so expensive. Like, they're bougie. Like, people would rent them in Europe during this time. They would rent a pineapple, not even to eat. They don't even get to keep it. They rent it for an hour or so to host a party so that people can come and look at their pineapple. So if you think about it, SpongeBob might be like a millionaire. Tomato. Can y'all imagine pizza without tomatoes? Can you imagine Italy, the home of spaghetti, without tomato sauce? Well, tomatoes came from the New World and then diffused into the Old World. So this is a huge benefit for the Europeans, this whole colonizing the New World thing. They get money, they get food, they get population boom, they get clout and glory for their empire. It's mostly going to be negative for the Americas and for Africa, however. Now, we see all these diseases down here, and we're like, okay, so a lot of diseases came from the Old World to the New World. Well, did the New World diffuse any diseases to the Old World? Now, back when I was in school forever ago, they taught us that syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease, came from the New World and then was brought back to the Old World through the Columbian exchange. Now they're finding some different evidence saying that actually syphilis might have originated in Europe and didn't come from the New World. Okay, so the best thing to do in that case is just to argue lots of diseases came from the Old World to the New World, and they had a huge negative effect. There was no disease that came from the New World to the Old World that killed off 90% of the Europeans. So first leg, Europe to Africa, manufactured goods. Second leg, Africa to Europe. This is where we're going to have the Middle Passage, or the asiento. And y'all, I have done a lecture series on Africa in the Atlantic world. It's in the old Imperialism folder. So this is the second leg with the Middle Passage. Then what goes from the New World back to Europe in leg 3? Profit, cash crops, gold and silver, raw materials that are then brought to Europe and manufactured. Sugar gets turned into rum, which is a form of alcohol. And then they continue creating guns and other trinkets and clothing, which they then take down to Africa to exchange for more slaves under the Portuguese, back to the Americas. And it's just a continual cycle. That's why it's called the triangular trade, is because it has 3 legs. You are responsible for knowing the legs, the direction that they go in, and what was exchanged on those legs, as well as the effects of that exchange. So again, if you're talking about cause and effect, you can't just answer an essay or an SAQ with, if it asks, what were the causes and the effects of the Columbian exchange in the New World, you can't just say, there were many. It's like, okay, Einstein, yes, there were many, but I need you to be specific. What type of causes? Economic causes, that's a big one. Political causes, that's a big one. What effects? Social effects, economic effects, political effects, demographic effects. Were they positive or were they negative? Were they mostly positive or mostly negative, with a little bit of positive and a little bit of negative for both? That is complexity if you say mostly good or mostly bad, but here's some exceptions. So for Europeans, it's really easy to argue that it was mostly beneficial. You really can't argue the other side of, oh, it was mostly bad for the Europeans. The only real negative consequence that we see from this is inflation from the price revolution, as Spain gets flooded with more gold and silver. But for the most part, they're coming out ahead. The Europeans get an improved diet. What is SFI to back up that claim? The potato. Yeah, you can't just make a claim and say, oh yeah, it was mostly positive for the Europeans. Like, for instance, they got an improved diet. Well, give me some evidence. What was improved in their diet? Well, the potato led to a population boom. But then that population boom also led to inflation and the price revolution, which was bad. For the rich people, at least, it was good for the middle class. The Columbian exchange led to increased wealth. Well, what evidence do we have of that? What SFI could you put for the increased wealth of the Europeans? Exactly right. First one, Gold and silver, bullion. But in addition to bullion, what else did they get from the New World that made them money? Raw materials like cash crops, tobacco, sugar, coffee. All of those are cash crops that are grown for profit. So they're making money off of that. And the rise of global empires. Global means we finally, for the first time, have all of the empires connected. They all know about each other. What's notable about this is that there's a change over time. The mighty empires of the Aztec fall, the Inca fall. Eventually, the empire in Mali is going to fall to the Songhai people. But the European countries are entering into their golden century, into their golden ages, particularly Spain and Portugal. Okay, so the rise of global empires, Spain controls all of this, and Portugal controls this, plus the trade around Africa, the western coast, to get to the spice trade. So yeah, they're pretty global. They're Mr. Worldwide. Whereas in contrast, for the Native Americans, really negative. Hardly any positives. Can we name some positives? Yes, we can name horses. But that's pretty much where it ends, right? It's like, yay, we got horses and we got beasts of burden, but we're literally dying from disease up to 90%, plus being conquered, plus being enslaved. Largely bad. They had once mighty empires with millions of people living in their immense cities with impressive architecture and infrastructure, and then the Europeans arrived, and it was all downhill from there. So if you're going to give evidence for this bullet point for, hey, the effects were bad, smallpox, super easy answer there. Encomienda, super easy answer there. Cortez conquering the Aztec, Pizarro conquering the Inca. All of that's SFI that answers this claim or thesis. The effects of the Columbian exchange for the Native Americans were bad. The effects of the Columbian exchange for the Europeans were positive. Does that make sense? That's 2 body paragraphs right there. Done. And you're not even talking about Africa yet. That's another body paragraph you can talk about. You can even talk about Asia. China benefits from the silver trade. Okay, so you have a bunch of different continents that you can include to make an essay with multiple body paragraphs. There is some confusion over what is New World and Old World. Y'all, this is new. All of this. Western Hemisphere. This is old. Eastern Hemisphere. The Columbian Exchange is named after Christopher Columbus because this is a 2-way exchange. It goes in both directions. It is from Old World to New World and from New World to Old World. So looking at this map, this is the New World, the Western Hemisphere. This is the Old World, the Eastern Hemisphere. Goods, ideas, people, diseases were exchanged across these 2 hemispheres. So this is a 2-way street. It goes in both directions. Now, who benefited the most from this exchange? That would be Europe 100%. Who suffered the most under this exchange? Either the New World, or you could argue Africa had a bunch of disadvantages that occurred from this. In terms of numbers, I think the Native Americans were hit demographically due to disease, although the Asiento does play a huge demographic negative role in the continent of Africa. So you're responsible in this Columbian exchange, not only knowing the 2-way exchange, but also knowing the 3 legs of the triangular trade. Why is it called the triangular trade? Because it makes a triangle. The first stop is Europe. So we start in Europe and go to Africa. Then it's from Africa to the New World. Then from the New World back to Europe. So that's why it's called the triangular trade. You're responsible for knowing these legs and what was traded on these legs, what was exchanged. So first leg, Europe to Africa. The Europeans were bringing manufactured goods. Manufactured means that they had to create it using raw materials. It wasn't something you could find in nature. So things like guns and alcohol. Don't find guns in nature. They don't grow on trees, right? So Europe manufactures these goods and then they take them to Africa to trade. Now, do they use these guns to conquer African kingdoms? No, because remember, the Europeans can't colonize Africa like they colonized the Americas. Okay, why is that? Malaria. The Bantu migration had spread not only malaria through Africa, but also sickle cell disease, which lent itself to immunity against malaria. The Europeans don't have that immunity. So the Europeans get malaria and they die to death. Why couldn't the Europeans use their military technology to take over Africa? Africa had the same military technology. Gunpowder technology had spread through the Mongolian conquest. The old world had been trading stuff with each other across those three continents for tens of thousands of years. So the mighty empires in Africa, like Mali and Ghana and Zimbabwe and Ethiopia, they had the same military technology. So if Europe tried to come in and get fresh, they would be fighting against people who were their equals or their superiors. So the Europeans could not colonize Africa. So Portugal resigned itself to establishing a trading post empire along the coast of Africa rather than the interior of Africa. Remember that Africa had major exports of gold and ivory and of slaves. But it's important to note that Old World slavery is different from New World slavery. Under Old World slavery, the people who were slaves were prisoners of war, debtors, criminals, witches, and slavery was not racial. It was not based on race. It was not hereditary. So the child of a slave did not automatically become a slave, and it was not permanent. So if you had sold yourself into slavery to pay off a debt, then once you paid off that debt, you're free again. So it could be for a temporary period of time. It was also not nearly as deadly. Remember that in Africa, there wasn't a concept of land ownership. Individuals didn't own the land. The land belonged to the community. So if you can't use land specifically to show off your wealth, how do you show that you have wealth? Well, by your ability to support your family. So polygamy in Africa, that allowed for men to have many wives and many children. By being able to support that immense number of wives and children, up to 4 wives, that shows that you are wealthy, that you could take care of your family. They also could show their wealth by the number of people that they owned, because they would have to be able to supply food and shelter and other life essentials in order to support the people that they had owned as property. So Old World slavery, very different from New World slavery. This is where we see a change over time. When the Portuguese start the Asiento, which is the African slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean, some things change. Now it's not just prisoners of war, debtors, or criminals. It's anyone that they can capture in Africa. And it becomes based on race. It becomes hereditary. It becomes permanent, and it becomes extremely deadly. About 50% of the people who were transported across the Middle Passage, and the Middle Passage is the second leg from Africa to the Americas, around 50% or more people who were captured and taken over to the Americas died en route. Then once they arrive in the Americas, the average life expectancy of a person working in the Brazilian sugar plantations for the Portuguese was 1 to 2 years. So extremely deadly. And that's because for the Portuguese, it was cheaper for them to work the population that they had captured to death rather than keep them alive, especially keeping them alive long enough in order to replenish the population. So New World slavery, based on race, hereditary, permanent, and it is far more deadly. And this is going to be extremely disruptive to the African continent for a number of reasons. Number one, you have an influx of weapons. So that increases conflict, especially as the African slave raiders run out of people from the bottom rungs of society that traditionally made up the slave class. African kingdoms go to war against other African kingdoms in order to capture more prisoners of war to sell as slaves. Once the lower classes that are typically a part of the slave class are depleted by the Portuguese demand for slaves, the African slave traders start grabbing from higher ranks in society. So even the elites and the noble classes, they run the risk of being captured and sold to the Portuguese. So it's disruptive demographically, it's disruptive politically, and also the majority of the people who were captured and enslaved were the male gender. So you see a decrease in the male gender in Africa. So that is disruptive for 2 reasons. Number one, it disrupts the patriarchy a little bit, and that women end up filling that power vacuum. They start taking positions of authority in Africa due to the spaces that are left empty. And also the practice of polygamy increases in Africa. There's not enough husbands to go around, so there are multiple wives. And that's able to help replenish the population that has been stolen from the continent. Now, the Portuguese, since they own the Asiento, they're going to be importing a higher number of enslaved Africans than the Spanish, because the Portuguese don't have to pay as much for it, whereas it is more expensive for the Spanish. So instead of the Spanish relying on the Asiento, at first the Spanish rely on enslaving the native populations that are already in the Americas. And what system did the Spanish use to enslave the Native Americans? Good, the encomienda. But the issue with the encomienda, beyond just the moral issue, was that the Native American population was decreasing due to both conquest and the spread of disease. So eventually the Spanish are going to start using the Asiento in order to maintain their profits. So the encomienda system is not going to be as productive due to the declining demographics of the New World, due to the arrival of disease and also conquest. And so that's going to lead to an increase in the Asiento, higher demand by the Portuguese in Africa. Then the third leg, what goes from America to Europe? Okay, that's going to be raw materials. Raw materials are things that you find in nature. So gold and silver, they are found in mines. Cash crops like sugar, tobacco, coffee, that's going to be grown in the Americas through coerced labor, and that doesn't enrich the Americas. The Americas don't get to keep any of that gold and silver or the profit that's generated by cash crops. Under mercantilism, the purpose of the colonies is to enrich the mother countries in Europe, Portugal and Spain. So those raw materials go from the Americas to Europe, where they're then used to create manufactured goods. What can sugar be manufactured into? Alcohol, rum. And so this starts the cycle, the triangular trade, all over again. By using the sugar that they get from the Americas, they're able to manufacture more alcohol, which they then take to Africa to exchange for enslaved peoples. Then they go to the Americas and use that forced labor to grow more cash crops. So it's a cycle. So the triangular trade are these three legs, but the Columbian exchange as a whole was stuff from New World going to Old World and stuff from Old World going to New World. Remember that Europe and Africa are a part of the Old World, along with Asia. So if you're given an essay talking about continuity and change over time, or cause and effect, if it asks you to talk about the causes and effects of the Columbian exchange, you can't just say there were many causes and there were many effects. You can't just say there were bad effects. You have to be specific. The main causes were economic, political, and religious causes for God, glory, and gold. And then for effects, you can talk about the negative demographic effects for Africa and the Americas. You can talk about the positive economic effects for Europe. All of that is specific. So make sure that you're creating those categories. For continuity and change over time, you could talk about how there were demographic changes in the New World. It used to be completely Native Americans, with Native Americans holding positions in the social hierarchy from the top, middle, and the bottom, to now you have Native Americans and Africans and Europeans in the New World. And the Native Americans no longer hold positions in all areas of society. They're relegated to the lower levels as the Europeans take over. Change over time in terms of demographics of the Native American population. They decrease significantly due to the spread of disease and conquest and enslavement. Okay, don't just say, yeah, there were causes and effects. Like, duh. That's like answering an essay question with yes. Like, no, we know that it's yes or no. You need to explain how and why. The biggest factor in the decline of the Native American population, with smallpox being the main one. Now, did the Europeans purposely spread disease when they first arrived? No. They didn't know about the New World. They didn't know about the lack of immunities in the New World. It wasn't like they came in with little vials marked smallpox. But later, after they noticed the effects of smallpox on the indigenous population, that's when it's going to start being used for biological warfare, including when the English settle in the original 13 colonies. They're going to have a lot of conflict with the Native Americans, and they're going to use smallpox as a method to wipe out the Native Americans so they can claim native land. For instance, calling peace treaties. And during these peace meetings, you're supposed to exchange gifts as a sign of goodwill. Well, some colonists would actually cover blankets with smallpox. They would rub it on people who had had smallpox and then knowingly give those blankets to the Native Americans, knowing that it would wipe out their population. It'd make it easier to take their land. Similar to how the Mongols used to catapult diseased bodies over fortifications in order to weaken a city under the siege. I've included this picture of me waking up in the morning for comic relief. When we talk about diet, when we talk about the food sources that they have, and New World versus Old World, the potato originated from the New World, but it's going to be very positive for the Old World. Why? Cause and effect, population boom. More food means less people starving, which means they live long enough to make babies. So the potato is going to become one of the most important staple crops in Europe. Remember, a staple crop just means the main food that they eat, the main food that they consume. Cash crops, not a staple crop. Corn is not a cash crop, it is a staple crop. Tobacco is not a staple crop, it is a cash crop. It is so important that you keep those separate, because I'll tell you every single time, I'll give what I think is an easy multiple choice question or an easy SAQ where I ask, like, name a cash crop, and someone will inevitably put down corn. And I'm just like, so please don't. Like y'all are writing down your notes, like corn and then a big X through it. Other foodstuffs that came from the New World to the Old World included corn, again, a staple crop. Pineapples, really bougie. Tomatoes, vanilla. Chocolate is a food, but it's going to be a luxury. You don't get chocolate like all you see today where you can just go anywhere and buy a chocolate bar for super cheap. It is for rich people. Okay, so tobacco is a cash crop. Vanilla is a cash crop. Chocolate, cocoa beans, cash crop. Coffee beans is also a cash crop. In terms of plants, the New World is going to get some cash crops and some food crops. Wheat and rice are grown for food. But remember, the farms and the plantations in the New World aren't supposed to be growing food. They're supposed to be growing profit for the mother country. So sugar and coffee originated from the Middle East and is going to diffuse into the New World and then be grown for cash crops. In terms of improving the diet of the Native Americans, they had more protein sources with cattle and pigs and goats, but they mostly lack beasts of burden. They had the alpaca and the llama in Peru, which is why the Peruvians, the Inca, were able to trade more long distance than the Aztec. But for the most part, these are new animals, new beasts of burden that assist in farming. But again, remember, the farming is not going to be focused on benefiting the indigenous or the Africans. It's going to be focused on benefiting the Europeans through cash crops. In terms of positive impacts on the Americas, the arrival of the horse was very helpful for the Native Americans because it allowed their culture to survive. So we're not just looking at literal death of the indigenous population from smallpox. We're also looking at cultural death, their religion being eliminated, their written works, their literature, their language, their way of life being eliminated. So social death. Okay, genocide isn't just talking about the physical death of people, it's also talking about the culture of people being eliminated. So the Plains Native Americans in what is today the the Midwest of the United States are going to utilize the arrival of horses to develop a new horse-based culture, a pastoral culture. They are not growing their own food as crops. Instead, they're nomadic and they're on horseback and they hunt and gather. So hunting buffalo. So they're able to escape west and preserve their culture to escape the Europeans' exploitation. Now, the turkey originated in the New World, and it's going to be very popular in Europe. But did y'all know that the turkey was almost our national bird? Yeah, what's our national bird right now? Right, the bald eagle. Now, I don't know if that would taste delicious or not, because they're endangered, so you can't eat a bald eagle. I know turkey's okay. I prefer ham or duck. But Benjamin Franklin said that turkey should be our national bird. He was a turkey stan, right, as the kids say. He believed that they were majestic, noble creatures. And I'm just over this. I'm like, gobble, gobble. But instead, they went with the bald eagle. So I'd imagine that if they had gone with the turkey, then we wouldn't have been able to eat them. But they are pretty impressive birds. They're huge.